December 19th, 1944. From the map room of the 5th Panzer Army headquarters, deep within the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, the world felt orderly, predictable, and destined for a German victory. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a staff officer of the old Prussian school, this was war as it should be, a precise application of logic, steel, and strategy. The air was thick with the scent of pine firewood, stale coffee, and the cold metallic smell of wet wool uniforms. On the immense map table, the symbols told a story of glorious success. Little wooden blocks representing German panzer divisions were deep inside the American lines, their red arrows pointing decisively west. The weather, a miserable, unending blanket of low cloud, freezing fog, and intermittent snow, was their greatest unspoken ally. It had rendered the feared Allied air forces utterly blind and useless. For days, not a single enemy fighter bomber had been seen in the sky. It was, as Field Marshal von Rundstedt had wryly noted, Hitler weather. Klaus and his fellow officers felt a confidence they hadn't experienced in years. They had studied their American adversaries exhaustively and had come to a simple, reassuring conclusion. They were soft. A nation of shopkeepers and jazz musicians, led by generals who were more politicians than soldiers. Their equipment was impressive, a testament to their industrial might, but their will was brittle. The initial shock of this surprise offensive, the largest Germany had mounted in the West since 1940, had shattered the American front line. Thousands of prisoners were being herded east, their faces a mask of stunned disbelief. They were boys, barely out of their teens, and they had the bewildered look of those who had never been truly tested. The German officers traded jokes in low, smug tones. The Americans fought from their jeeps and relied on their air cover. Take that away, put them in a frozen forest against hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, and they folded. Then came the reports about the American general being brought in to counter them. George S. Patton. This news brought a fresh wave of derisive laughter to the command post. Patton, the cowboy general. They knew all about him. They had dossiers filled with his exploits, his profane speeches, his pearl-handled pistols. To the German general staff, men who saw war as a grim science, Patton was an absurdity, a professional embarrassment. He was an undisciplined, glory-hunting showman who, by some fluke of fate, had been given command of an army. They laughed at his supposed recklessness, his penchant for slapping soldiers, his utter lack of tactical finesse. He was, in their professional opinion, a clown in a helmet. An intelligence intercept brought a particular piece of information that day that was so bizarre, so utterly un-Prussian, that Klaus had to read it twice to ensure the translator hadn't made a mistake. A captured dispatch, retrieved from a disabled American jeep, contained a small, pocket-sized card. On it was a printed prayer. It was a prayer for fair weather, composed by a Catholic chaplain on the direct order of General Patton himself. Below the prayer was a Christmas greeting from Patton to his men. The final line of the intercept noted that 250,000 of these cards had been distributed to every man in the American Third Army. Klaus read it aloud to the others in the room. A moment of silence was followed by an eruption of incredulous laughter. A general, in the midst of the largest battle of the war on the Western Front, was not consulting his logisticians or his meteorologists, but was praying. He was ordering his entire army to pray for the clouds to part. "Perhaps we should pray for more snow," one major chuckled, and the room roared. It was perfect. It was the ultimate confirmation of everything they believed about the Americans. They weren't serious warriors. Their leadership was superstitious, their resolve weak, their approach to the grim calculus of war hopelessly naive. Klaus tacked the translated text of the absurd prayer to the bulletin board. It became a running joke for the rest of the day. The Americans were trapped in Bastogne, their supply lines were cut, and their relief force was being led by a man who thought he could petition God to change the weather. The German generals were more certain than ever. They were not just going to win this battle. They were going to humiliate an enemy who was too foolish to even understand the rules of the game. They couldn't believe this was their opponent. This deep-seated contempt was not an accident. It was the carefully cultivated product of a worldview forged in the fires of Nazi propaganda and a century of Prussian military tradition. From the moment he had entered the military academy, Klaus had been taught that the German soldier, the Lanzer, was the finest fighting man in the world. He was tough, disciplined, and ideologically motivated. He was the heir to the legacy of Frederick the Great and von Clausewitz. The state propaganda machine, run by Joseph Goebbels, reinforced this message daily. It painted a picture of Germany as a nation of stoic warrior philosophers besieged by enemies who were racially and culturally inferior. The Soviets were brutish, subhuman hordes. The British were tired, decadent aristocrats clinging to a dying empire. And the Americans were the most perplexing and, in many ways, the most contemptible of all. They were a mongrel nation, a chaotic mix of races with no history, no culture, and no soul. Their power was purely material. They could build mountains of tanks and planes, but the men who operated them were weak, comfort-loving individuals corrupted by capitalism and Hollywood. German newsreels and newspapers consistently portrayed American soldiers as clumsy, ill-disciplined, and easily frightened. They were shown surrendering in droves, their hands held high, their faces soft and scared. Captured American equipment was displayed with a sneer. The rations, filled with chocolates and chewing gum, were presented as proof of a military that was more concerned with creature comforts than with fighting. The generals, like Eisenhower and Bradley, were depicted as desk jockeys, administrators who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Patton was a special case. He was too loud, too ostentatious to ignore. So, the propaganda machine painted him as the perfect example of American arrogance and foolishness. His pearl-handled revolvers were not the mark of a warrior, but of a child playing dress-up. His aggressive speeches were not inspirational, but the ravings of a madman. The German high command saw him as a useful caricature, a symbol of the enemy's fundamental lack of seriousness. They never knew that this perception was one of their greatest vulnerabilities. They saw a clown and missed the killer. What the German General Staff, in their rigid professionalism, failed to grasp was the uniquely American approach to warfare that Patton embodied. It was an approach that blended staggering industrial power with a peculiar, almost spiritual, form of psychological motivation. The American way of war was not born in the ancient forests of Prussia, but on the factory floors of Detroit and in the revival tents of the heartland. It was a system that understood that the morale of a free citizen soldier was a different beast from that of a conscript in a totalitarian state. You couldn't simply command it, you had to inspire it. Patton, for all his aristocratic airs, understood the soul of the common American GI. He knew they were not professional soldiers. They were mechanics, farmers, and clerks who wanted nothing more than to win the war and go home. And to get them to do the impossible, to push them beyond the limits of human endurance, you couldn't just issue orders. You had to put on a show. The prayer card was a stroke of psychological genius that was utterly lost on his enemies. The Germans saw it as a sign of weakness, of a desperate turn to superstition. They couldn't have been more wrong. For Patton, it was a tool of leadership as potent as a tank battalion. First, it was an act of supreme confidence. By ordering a prayer for clear weather, he was sending an unambiguous message to his men: we are going to advance. The only thing that can stop us is the weather, and I'm taking care of that. I am so certain of our victory that I am enlisting God himself on our side. For the GIs huddled in their freezing foxholes, exhausted and afraid, this was an electrifying message. It was audacious, it was arrogant, and it was exactly what they needed to hear. It transformed an abstract meteorological problem into a spiritual crusade. Second, it was a masterful act of shared experience. By distributing 250,000 of these cards, Patton made every single soldier a participant in his plan. They weren't just waiting for orders. They were now part of a collective appeal to a higher power. It unified the Third Army in a way no standard order of the day ever could. Whether a soldier was a devout believer or a hardened cynic, he had the card in his pocket. He was in on it. He was part of Patton's audacious gamble. This was a form of leadership, The German command structure, with its rigid hierarchy and emotional distance, could never replicate. To them, soldiers were cogs in a machine. To Patton, they were an audience, and he was the greatest showman on earth. And as the German generals laughed in their bunkers, they remained blissfully unaware that the foundations of their worldview were about to be shattered by the very force they had so arrogantly dismissed. The cowboy was coming, and he was bringing the sunshine with him. For 4 more days, the German general's laughter seemed justified. The weather held. The skies remained a uniform, impenetrable slate grey. The offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was proceeding, if not perfectly, then at least with powerful momentum. The panzer columns of the 5th Panzer Army and the 6th SS Panzer Army ground their way deeper into the American lines, a steel tide chewing through the frozen Belgian landscape. From his command post, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter continued to move the wooden blocks across the map. The northern shoulder of the American Bulge was proving tougher than expected, but the southern advance was relentless. The key objective was the Meuse River, and they were getting closer every hour. The primary obstacle was the besieged American position at the crossroads town of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded, refused to surrender, their commander famously replying, "Nuts," to the German demand. This was an annoyance, a delay, but not a fatal one. The town was a bone in their throat, but the main armoured spearheads were bypassing it, leaving it to be strangled into submission. The mood in the German command posts remained one of grim, professional confidence. They knew Patton's Third Army was on the move, pivoting north in a remarkable feat of logistics to relieve Bastogne. But they were marching into a meat grinder. The terrain was difficult, the roads were icy, and every village was being turned into a fortress by veteran German troops. Most importantly, Patton's men were marching without air cover. The German officers were stunned by the speed of Patton's maneuver. He had disengaged from another front and wheeled his entire army 90 degrees in less than 48 hours, but they were convinced it was a reckless, desperate gamble doomed to fail. Every intelligence report confirmed their belief. The American advance was struggling. They were taking heavy casualties, and the worsening snowstorms were slowing their columns to a crawl. The joke about Patton's prayer card had become a grimly satisfying punchline. It seemed the American god was a German ally after all. The generals began to believe that the weather was not just an advantage. It was a sign of destiny. It was proof that their cause, their science of war, was superior. They laughed at the thought of those 250,000 prayer cards, imagining them turning to soggy pulp in the pockets of frozen American corpses. On the morning of December 23rd, Klaus Richter awoke to the same familiar gloom. The air was cold and damp, the sky a low, oppressive ceiling. The reports from the front were good. German units were pressing the perimeter around Bastogne, their artillery pounding the trapped Americans. Patton's relief force was still miles away, bogged down in brutal fighting. It was a day like any other in the offensive, a day of German advantage. Around mid-morning, however, something changed. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A slight thinning of the fog, a hint of brightness in the suffocating greyness overhead. No one paid it much mind. The weather in the Ardennes was notoriously fickle, but then a sliver of blue appeared, then another. Within an hour, a meteorological miracle, or from the German perspective, a catastrophe was occurring. The thick, week-long cloud cover that had been their shield began to break apart, torn asunder by a sudden, inexplicable shift in the wind. By noon, the sun was shining. The brilliant, blinding winter Sunday. It reflected off the pristine snow, making the entire landscape glitter with a terrifying beauty. For a moment, there was just confusion. A stunned silence fell over the German columns snaking their way along the narrow, forest-lined roads. The soldiers, who had grown accustomed to the comforting twilight of the eternal overcast, looked up at the naked blue sky with a sense of profound unease. It felt unnatural, a violation of the established order of the battle. In the command posts, the initial reaction was one of pure, logistical annoyance. The clear skies meant the possibility of Allied reconnaissance planes. They would have to be more careful about camouflage and movement. But this flicker of professional concern was instantly vaporized by a new sensation, the sound. It began as a low, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a sound that every German soldier who had served on the Western Front had learned to dread more than artillery, more than tanks, more than anything else on earth. It was the sound of engines, not one or two, but hundreds, then thousands. The hum grew into a deep guttural drone that seemed to make the very air tremble. It grew louder and louder until it was an all-consuming, apocalyptic roar that drowned out every other sound. The German soldiers looked up from their foxholes and tanks, their faces pale with a sudden, sickening understanding. The sky was no longer empty. It was filled with them. Swarms of them. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings. They circled like vultures, thousands of feet up, glittering silver predators against the impossible blue. The Jabos, as the Germans called them, a contraction of jagged bomber or fighter bomber, had arrived. And they were hungry. The first attack was a study in brutal, merciless efficiency. A squadron of Thunderbolts peeled off from the main formation, their blunt noses tipping down into a steep, shrieking dive. For the men of a German supply column moving toward the Bastogne front, the world simply ended. One moment they were in a convoy of trucks and half-tracks, grumbling about the cold. The next, they were at the heart of a volcano. The air was torn apart by the percussive thump, thump, thump of rockets, leaving their underwing pylons, followed instantly by shattering explosions that tossed 2-ton trucks into the air like children's toys. Then came the sound of the machine guns. 8 50-caliber guns on each Thunderbolt, a combined firepower that one pilot famously described as a flying shotgun. The sound was not a rattle, but a deafening metallic roar, like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas. The heavy slugs shredded everything they touched. They ripped through the thin steel of engine blocks, turning them into clouds of steam and smoke. They tore through the canvas covers of trucks, and the men huddled inside. They scythed through the crews of anti-aircraft guns before they could even traverse their weapons skyward. The shock was absolute. There was no defense, no escape. For the German soldiers caught on those roads, their world shrank to a universe of noise, fire, and unimaginable violence. Panic replaced discipline. Men leaped from moving vehicles, only to be cut down in the snow. Drivers tried to swerve off the roads and were instantly bogged down, becoming stationary targets. The entire strategic situation had been inverted in a matter of minutes. The roads, which had been arteries of German strength, were now death traps. The panzers, so formidable against infantry, were vulnerable, their supply lines of fuel and ammunition being systematically erased from the sky. Over the radios came a torrent of panicked, screaming voices, calling for help that would never come. Reports of entire columns being annihilated flooded the headquarters of the 5th Panzer Army. What had been a neatly advancing line on Klaus Richter's map was now a series of disconnected, burning dots. In the command post, the laughter was gone, replaced by a cold, leaden dread. The officers stood frozen, listening to the reports of carnage with expressions of numb disbelief. They were shocked. The shift had been too sudden, too total. One moment they were masters of the battlefield, the next they were helpless ants under a magnifying glass. The entire foundation of their strategy, the foul weather, had been pulled out from under them. Klaus looked at the translated prayer tacked to the bulletin board. It no longer seemed absurd. It seemed like a curse. A prophecy fulfilled. The American cowboy general had asked for a miracle, and the indifferent universe had, by some cosmic coincidence, delivered one. The German generals couldn't believe it. Their rigid, logical minds were incapable of processing what had happened. It wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a psychological and spiritual collapse. Their enemy, the soft, foolish, praying American, had somehow summoned the wrath of the heavens. As the sun set on that terrible day, casting long shadows from the endless columns of burning German wreckage, the men of the Wehrmacht knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the marrow, that the war was lost. They had laughed at Patton's belief in a higher power. They weren't laughing now. The terror that dawned on December 23rd, 1944, did not fade with the setting Sunday. German commanders, clinging to a desperate hope, believed it might be a fluke, a single day of clear skies before the protective blanket of winter returned. They were catastrophically wrong. The change in the weather was not a temporary reprieve for the Americans. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of the war. What had been a single, shocking event transformed, overnight, into a relentless, systematic, and inescapable new reality. The German soldiers were stunned to discover that the Allied air forces did not operate like their own Luftwaffe. They did not simply fly sorties to support specific ground operations. Instead, they unleashed a concept of war the Germans had theorized about, but had never seen executed on such a grand, merciless scale: total battlefield interdiction. The sky above the Ardennes was no longer a neutral space. It now belonged to the Americans, and they patrolled it with the grim efficiency of a prison warden making his rounds. This new system was called armed reconnaissance. The term sounded sterile, almost academic, but in practice, it was the methodical application of industrial-scale slaughter. Squadrons of P-47 seconds, P-51 seconds, and medium bombers were not given specific targets. Instead, they were assigned sectors of the map, grids of forest and road, and given a simple, terrifying directive: destroy everything that moves. Every truck, every train, every tank, every soldier caught in the open was a legitimate target. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was an extermination. For the German Lancer, the world was turned upside down. The most basic and instinctual military actions, resupplying, moving reinforcements, even retreating, became suicidal. Daylight, once the friend of the attacker, was now the enemy. The German army, the mighty Wehrmacht that had prided itself on its lightning advances and bold maneuvers, was forced to hide. It became an army of nocturnal creatures, cowering in forests and camouflaged barns during the day, daring only to creep along shattered roads in the dead of night. The psychological effect was devastating. The feeling of being constantly watched, of being hunted from above by an invisible enemy who could strike at any moment, was a poison that seeped into the morale of every soldier. They never knew that this was the deliberate American strategy: to break not just the German supply lines, but the German will to fight. The most powerful weapon in the German arsenal, the apex of their engineering prowess, was the Tiger II, or King Tiger tank. It was a 68-ton monster, its frontal armor almost impervious to any Allied tank gun, and its own long 88mm cannon could kill a Sherman from over a mile away. For Panzer Commandant Rolf Steiner, his King Tiger was more than a machine. It was a symbol of German superiority, a rolling fortress of Teutonic steel. On December 24th, his platoon of 4 Tigers was tasked with spearheading an assault on a stubborn American roadblock. They had pushed the American infantry back, their massive cannons turning Sherman tanks into blazing pyres. But their advance had consumed a tremendous amount of fuel. The engines, marvels of engineering, were also notoriously thirsty, burning through hundreds of litres of gasoline every hour. By late afternoon, his tank's fuel gauge was hovering near empty. He radioed back, his voice calm and professional, requesting the fuel convoy that was scheduled to meet them. The reply was a crackle of static, then a panicked voice mentioning Jarbos. An hour passed. Rolf's confidence began to waver. His invincible fortress was now just a 68-ton steel box, stranded on a frozen road. Through his binoculars, he scanned the road behind him. A thin plume of black smoke was rising from the forest, miles away. He knew, with a sickening certainty, what it was. His fuel was burning, not in his engine, but in the wreckage of a supply truck. Later that night, a single, terrified soldier from the convoy staggered into their position, his face blackened with soot, his uniform in tatters. He spoke of a sudden attack from the sky, of rockets and machine guns that had appeared from nowhere and turned the entire column of fuel and ammunition trucks into a chain of fireballs in less than 30 seconds. The men in Rolf's crew were silent. Their faces, illuminated by the dim light of the instrument panel, were masks of disbelief and dawning horror. They were shocked. Their magnificent tank, the pride of the Reich, had been defeated without a single shot being fired at it. It was rendered impotent by the destruction of a few soft-skinned Opel trucks miles away. For the rest of the war, Rolf and his crew would be forced to abandon their King Tiger, a perfectly functional machine, and join the retreat on foot, because the American industrial machine had decided they would not be allowed to have gasoline. The Americans weren't just fighting their tanks, they were fighting their logistics, a war the Germans had no way to win. While men like Rolf Steiner were being strangled at the tactical level, the German High Command was facing the same crisis on a strategic scale. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, seeing his offensive stalling, desperately tried to move reinforcements to the front. The elite 2nd and 9th SS Panzer divisions were ordered to entrain and move toward the Ardennes. For the German railway system, once the envy of Europe, this was a routine operation. It became a journey through hell. From the moment the trains left the marshalling yards in Germany, they were hunted. American reconnaissance planes, flying with impunity, spotted the movements and called in the hunters. Squadrons of Thunderbolts descended on the rail lines, not just bombing the trains, but systematically dismantling the infrastructure of the railway itself. They didn't just crater the tracks, they blew up junctions, destroyed switching yards, leveled signal boxes, and strafed water towers for the steam locomotives. A German railway engineer later recounted the sheer futility of it. A crew would work all night under blackout conditions to repair a section of track, only to have a flight of P-47 seconds arrive at dawn and obliterate their work in a matter of minutes. For the soldiers packed into the cattle cars, it was a terrifyingly helpless experience. They could hear the roar of the planes, feel the train screech to a halt, and then there was nothing to do but pray as the world outside erupted in fire and screaming metal. The journey, which should have taken a day, stretched into a week of start-stop movements, of constant fear and sudden violent death. Divisions arrived at the front piecemeal, exhausted, demoralized, and having already suffered casualties before they had even seen an American infantryman. This war on logistics extended to the most humble yet most vital components of the army. A single supply truck trying to ferry ammunition or bread from a rear depot to the front lines was embarking on a mission more perilous than a frontal assault. Drivers learned to fear open ground. A bridge, a crossroads, a straight stretch of road, all were killing zones. The American pilots became incredibly skilled at spotting the slightest sign of movement. They would strafe a suspicious-looking clump of trees on the off chance a truck was hidden beneath it. The result was a creeping paralysis. The German frontline soldier was not only being attacked by the American soldiers in front of him, but was being slowly starved and deprived by an enemy he could not see or fight. His grenades didn't arrive, his hot meals were replaced by cold iron rations, and his machine gun ammunition ran low. This was the true expression of American industrial power. Not just the ability to build planes, but the ability to create a system of such total dominance that it could reach down and touch every single soldier in the enemy army, making his life a living hell. Through all of this, one thing became the unifying symbol of this new, terrifying reality: a sound. It was the deep, throaty, slightly uneven roar of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the 18-cylinder radial engine that powered the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was a sound utterly unlike the high-pitched scream of the German Messerschmitts or the droning of their own bombers. It was a dense, powerful, industrial noise. To the German soldiers, it became the soundtrack of their doom. They would be huddled in a forest, thinking they were safe, and then they would hear that low, building roar in the distance. And in that moment, all activity would cease. Men would freeze, their blood turning to ice. It was a Pavlovian response. That sound meant death was circling overhead. It was the sound of American power, the audible manifestation of Detroit's factories. It was the roar of a nation that could build thousands of these flying artillery platforms and send them over the horizon, day after day, without cease. The German generals had laughed at a prayer on a piece of paper. Now, they and every one of their men trembled at a sound in the air. The joke had become a recurring nightmare, a symbol of a power so vast and relentless, they were only just beginning to comprehend it. Inside the chilly subterranean command bunker of Army Group B, the atmosphere of smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a frantic, acrid tension. The maps, once a source of pride, were now a testament to a cascading disaster. Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known for his ruthless energy and defensive genius, stared at the reports with a grim, hollowed-out expression. The initial disbelief of his staff had curdled into a cold, terrifying realization. The Ardennes offensive was bleeding to death on the roads. It was not being defeated by American tanks or infantry in a classic battle of maneuver. It was being systematically dismembered from the air. The reports from the front were no longer about advances or tactical victories. They were a monotonous, horrifying litany of destruction. A supply column of 60 trucks annihilated near Street Vith. An entire battalion of assault guns caught refueling and wiped out. A vital bridge destroyed, trapping a panzer division on the wrong side of a river. The German High Command, which had prided itself on its mastery of blitzkrieg, was being subjected to a new kind of lightning war, one waged from the sky, and they were utterly powerless to stop it. The official realization was as sudden as it was humiliating. The Hitler weather they had relied upon had betrayed them, and in doing so, had exposed the fundamental flaw in their entire strategy. They had planned a 1940-style campaign for a 1944 reality. In 1940, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies. Now, it was a ghost. In a heated conference, generals who had weeks earlier mocked American weakness were now shouting, demanding answers, demanding a solution to the Jarbo plague. The initial arrogance gave way to finger-pointing and desperation. They had fatally underestimated not just American industrial might, but the speed and ferocity with which it could be deployed. They had laughed at Patton's prayer, seeing it as the plea of a weak man, but were now confronted with a force so overwhelming it felt biblical in its wrath. The order of the day was no longer "on to the Meuse," but "how do we survive until nightfall?" In response to this crisis, the German war machine did what it did best. It improvised with desperate, ultimately futile, countermeasures. The first response was to unleash the flak, mobile anti-aircraft batteries quad-barreled 20mm, Flak-Vierlings and potent 88mm guns were rushed toward the front lines. They were ordered to set up flak traps along key roads, hoping to ambush the American fighter bombers. For a day or two, this tactic claimed a handful of victims. But the Germans were shocked to discover the American response. The Thunderbolt pilots were not deterred by the flak. They seemed to relish the challenge. Instead of avoiding the flak traps, they attacked them head-on. German gun crews watched in horror as the P-47 seconds, planes so famously durable, they were nicknamed jugs, would dive directly into their own streams of tracer fire. They would absorb dozens of hits, their armoured engines and rugged airframes shrugging off damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt, and would press their attack until their rockets and 50-caliber guns had silenced the battery. The Americans were willing to trade a multi-ton aircraft for a single anti-aircraft gun, a brutal economic calculation the resource-starved Germans simply could not match. The flak crews, once confident in their firepower, quickly learned they were the hunted, not the hunters. The next desperate measure was to call upon the Luftwaffe. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, in a fit of rage, ordered every available fighter to the Ardennes front in a last-ditch effort called Operation Bodenplatte, scheduled for New Year's Day. But even before that ill-fated attack, small formations of battle-hardened German pilots tried to challenge the Allied swarms. It was suicide. A German ace, a veteran of 100 dogfights on the Eastern Front, might take off with his squadron of 12 Focke-Wulf 192nds. As they climbed through the crystalline winter air, they wouldn't encounter an enemy squadron, they would encounter an enemy air force. They would see, stretching to the horizon, hundreds upon hundreds of American planes, Mustangs flying high cover, Thunderbolts prowling at medium altitude, and bombers arrayed in impenetrable combat boxes. For every one German fighter, there were 10, sometimes 20, Allied aircraft. a German pilot might skillfully pounce on a lone P-47, only to find himself instantly bracketed by 4 P-51 seconds diving from the Sunday. The dogfights were a blur of mismatched fury. The German pilots were skilled, their planes were good, but they were overwhelmed by sheer, impossible numbers. They were like a handful of expert swordsmen trying to fight a tidal wave. They would be lucky to shoot down 1 or 2 planes before being swarmed, their wings torn off by the concentrated fire of a dozen aircraft. The Luftwaffe was being fed into the meat grinder, and the sky remained firmly in American hands. With all active measures failing, the German army was forced to adopt the tactics of a hunted animal. Strict draconian orders were issued. All movement during daylight hours was forbidden. A single truck moving down a road was now seen as an act of suicidal recklessness. The panzer divisions, the spearhead of the offensive, were now paralyzed, forced to hide in dense pine forests from dawn until dusk. Crews would spend hours painstakingly covering their massive tanks with branches and snow, trying to erase their existence from the prying eyes above, a crippling paranoia, which the soldiers called Jabo Shrek fighter bomber terror, set in. It was a constant, nerve-shredding anxiety. A soldier could not light a fire to warm his freezing hands for fear the smoke would be seen. A cough could feel dangerously loud. The shadow of a passing cloud could make a whole platoon flinch and dive for cover. This was the ultimate psychological victory for the Americans. The once proud German army, the conquerors of Europe, were now terrified of the Sunday. This relentless pressure from the sky eroded more than just the German army's ability to fight. It shattered its spirit. The average lancer, huddled in a frozen foxhole, listening to the incessant roar of the Thunderbolts overhead, felt a profound sense of abandonment. Where was the Luftwaffe they had been promised? Why were their wonder weapons, the mighty King Tigers and jet fighters, unable to protect them? The propaganda he had been fed his entire life was dissolving in the face of this terrifying reality. The Americans were not soft. They were not decadent. They were relentless, powerful, and terrifyingly efficient. Their power seemed limitless. A soldier would watch a flight of Thunderbolts unload rockets and bombs on a position, only to see them replaced 10 minutes later by another identical flight, and then another and another, in an endless aerial conveyor belt of destruction. It was a power that felt industrial, impersonal, and absolute. It crushed the German soldier's belief in his own superiority, his faith in his leaders, and ultimately, his will to continue the fight. The war was no longer a noble struggle, it was a one-sided execution. In the pocket of a dead American captain, a German intelligence officer found one of Patton's prayer cards. He read the simple words asking for clear weather. He didn't laugh. He tucked it carefully into his own tunic. It was a souvenir from a foe whose source of power was something he had completely failed to comprehend. A power that seemed to blend the spiritual with the industrial in a way that was both absurd and terrifyingly, undeniably victorious. The story of General Patton's prayer and the subsequent clearing of the skies is not merely a curious historical anecdote about a timely coincidence. It is the perfect, crystalline symbol of the collision between two fundamentally different worlds, two opposing philosophies of war and national power. The German generals laughed because, within their rigid framework of logic, science, and a deep-seated belief in their own martial superiority, Patton's action was nonsensical. It was a sign of desperation, a retreat into primitive superstition. What they failed to comprehend was that the prayer was not the weapon itself. It was the psychological trigger for a weapon they could not see, measure, or counter. The full, unleashed fury of American industrial might. The force that shattered the 5th Panzer Army was not an act of God. It was an act of Detroit, of Buffalo, of factories in California and Kansas, all channeled through the will of a commander who understood how to meld the spiritual motivation of his men with the overwhelming material power of his nation. Germany, in the final years of the war, had placed its faith in technological perfectionism. Their ideology was reflected in their war machines: the King Tiger tank, the Messerschmitt 260, II jet fighter, the V-2 rocket. These were exquisite, complex, and often over-engineered marvels, designed by brilliant minds to be the best in their class. They were the product of a nation that believed a few superior weapons, wielded by a few superior men, could triumph over brute numbers. It was an aristocratic view of warfare. The American approach, the one that filled the skies over the Ardennes, was profoundly different. It was democratic, it was pragmatic, and it was rooted in the sheer, continent-spanning scale of its industry. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not as elegant as a Focke-Wulf 190, but it was tougher, could carry a heavier payload, and, most importantly, it could be mass-produced by the thousands. American factories were turning out more planes in a single month than German factories could produce in a year. The American philosophy was not to build one perfect weapon, but to build 10,000 very good ones and overwhelm the enemy with a relentless, irresistible tide of steel. The German generals were waiting for a decisive duel between knights. The Americans buried them in an avalanche. This was the macro theme of the entire war made manifest in a single battle. The victory of pragmatic, mass-produced quantity over idealistic, handcrafted quality. The ultimate demonstration of this victory came not on the roads choked with burning German armor, but in the sky above the beleaguered town of Bastogne. For a week, the men of the 101st Airborne had held out, surrounded, low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food, under constant artillery bombardment in the freezing cold. Their ability to resist was the critical linchpin holding the entire American line together. The Germans were convinced that it was only a matter of time before the pocket collapsed. Then, on December 23rd, the sky cleared. The trapped paratroopers looked up, their faces gaunt and frostbitten, and saw a sight they would never forget. The sky was filled with American planes, not just the fighter bombers that were now tormenting their besiegers, but lumbering C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft. By the hundreds, they flew in stately, unopposed formations, dropping brightly colored parachutes laden with everything the division needed: plasma, ammunition, food, and mail from home. For the Germans watching from the surrounding forests, this was the final, soul-crushing spectacle. They were stunned. This was a display of power so total, so audacious, it bordered on arrogance. The Americans were not just destroying the German army on the ground, they were simultaneously running a massive, unimpeded aerial relief operation in the middle of what was supposed to be a German offensive. They owned the sky so completely that they could use it for logistics as casually as if they were delivering milk. It was the ultimate proof of dominance. It showed that America could not only fight a war of annihilation against the Wehrmacht's spearheads, but could also, at the same time, sustain and nurture its own isolated troops with an aerial lifeline that the Luftwaffe was utterly powerless to intercept. It was the industrial and moral victory condensed into a single, stunning visual. The Germans were left to watch, helpless and defeated, as the very air above them became an instrument of their enemy's will and a symbol of their own impotence. In the end, the German generals did not just lose a battle, they lost their entire conception of the world. Their belief in the supremacy of their military science, their ideology, and their national destiny was shattered by a reality they had been too arrogant to foresee. They had laughed at the enemy's belief in prayer, only to be destroyed by the industrial might that prayer had unleashed. They had sneered at a nation of shopkeepers, only to find that those shopkeepers could build a war machine that dwarfed their own. The final verdict of the Ardennes was written in the contrails of 1,000 bombers and the wreckage of 1,000 panzers. It was a verdict that declared a new order in the world, one where victory belonged not to the nation with the most ancient military traditions, but to the one with the deepest reserves of ingenuity, industrial capacity, and a strange, unshakable belief in its own audacious possibilities. The laughter died in the forests of the Ardennes, replaced by the roar of American engines, a sound that would echo through the final, bitter months of the war as the sound of inevitable, total, and absolute victory.